We're glad you decided to check out this message by Seabreeze Church and hope that you benefit from it. We also hope that you would join us either online or in person on a Sunday. We have a 9 o'clock live stream service online, and then we have in-person services on our campus at 9 and 10:30. So again, we hope that you would join us, and we hope that you enjoy this message.
Good morning. My name's Andrew. I'm the worship pastor here, and it's so good to be speaking with you all this morning. Now, we're smack dab in the middle of a series called God's Grand Story, where we're looking at the overarching story of the Bible. The point really is to see what God has been doing throughout human history and join in the story ourselves. God has been at work, and He's still working, and He calls each one of us off the couch and gives us a meaningful part to play in the story. Now, I say we're smack dab in the middle of this series because last week, Bevan wrapped up the Old Testament. That's the first 39 books of the Bible. And in the Old Testament, we are shown again and again that the big problem of humanity is our sinful hearts. The problem isn't external, it's not our circumstances, it's internal. And the sinfulness of our hearts causes us to reject God and His rule in our lives. Now, next week, we're actually going to look at the New Testament, the last 27 books of the Bible, which give us the answer to the problem, and that's Jesus. But today, we'll be looking at the time in between the two testaments. We'll dive into the events and the people that form the context surrounding Jesus' life and ministry. And then we'll look at a passage from the New Testament that shows us why knowing these things actually matters as we read the Bible. But first, I'd like to actually start today with an activity, a group activity. It's super easy, I promise. Everyone just grab a Bible. They're all around the room. Every other chair has one. And then go ahead and turn to the last page of the Old Testament. If you're using one of the Seabreeze Bibles, it's page 670. So let's all turn there together. It's the last page of the Old Testament. All right. Now, once you're there, flip the one or two pages that get you to the New Testament. Flip until it says New Testament or the book of Matthew. Well, you just flipped through 400 years of history. There's a lot going on. And there's a lot of context that you skip in those pages, and I want you to know it as you read the Bible. This 400-year period is actually referred to as the intertestamental period, the period between the testaments, or the 400 years of silence. God was still at work during that time, but no prophet rose up to speak for God like the prophets of the Old Testament. So actually a lot of interesting things happen in that 400 years. The Israel that we see at the end of the Old Testament is very different than the Israel we see at the beginning of the New Testament, just one page later. God was moving the events of human history to the point where it was just right for Jesus to come on the scene. Jesus was born at the perfect time. That's your first fill in the blank on your outline today. Jesus was born at the perfect time. In the New Testament, we see this idea reflected by Paul. He's one of the early church planters. And referring to the time and circumstances of Jesus' birth, he wrote this in Galatians 4:4-5. It says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." Now, I summarize these verses really with two main points. Jesus is the perfect sacrifice at the perfect time. Jesus is the complete or the perfect answer to our heart problem that we discovered in the Old Testament. And in order for Jesus to be the perfect answer, the circumstances of His life and ministry had to be just right. And looking back, we can tell that they were. There's no denying the effectiveness of Jesus' life and ministry. We're here 2,000 years later, halfway around the globe, still trying to follow Him. So it really begs the question, what were the major events in Israel's history that led up to the arrival of Jesus that made His timing so right? And I think to answer that question, it's actually helpful to go back to the first kingdom of Israel to get the fuller picture. Now, Israel's first king, his name was Saul. He looked like a king on the outside, but his heart was wicked. So his throne went to a man named David. He's generally remembered as a great king. Then David's son, Solomon, takes over, and the kingdom is united. They're doing well. Everything seems to be going well. One of Solomon's big accomplishments was actually building the temple for God. It's a permanent structure where they would meet to worship. And after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel, it divides into two. It splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel make up the northern kingdom. It's called Israel. And then the remaining 2 make up the southern kingdom called Judah. That's actually where Jerusalem and the temple were at this time. And on the back half of the Old Testament, God uses 3 different nations to bring judgment on the people of Israel because their hearts had turned away from him. First, Assyria captures the northern kingdom of Israel, and they rule from about 883 BC to 612 BC. During that time, the Israelites, they were scattered among the other exiled people. Basically, the northern tribes of Israel were absorbed into Assyria, and they never recovered. They intermarried and were lost to history. Then, in 612 BC, Babylon came in and conquered Assyria, plus the southern kingdom of Judah. They got everybody. The Babylonians ruled for about 70 years. They destroyed the temple, and then they exiled the people of Judah as well, where they forced the people of Judah out of their homes and into a foreign nation. And then, in 538 BC, Persia captured the Babylonian Empire. And under Persia, God's people are allowed to return and rebuild Jerusalem in the temple. And that's where we actually end the Old Testament. The people of God are allowed to return to their city, but they were still a conquered nation. The fullness of Israel had not been restored. They paid taxes to foreign governments. They followed different leaders that were government appointed, not the kings from their own people. The temple was rebuilt, but it lacked the glory of the original. And at the end of the Old Testament, the people were left waiting for a king from the line of David who would complete the restoration of Israel. So I guess in summary, at the end of the Old Testament, Israel's a real bummer. I mean, there's really no other way to say it. Now, when we flip the pages to the New Testament, the Israel we see, it looks very different from the one at the end of the Old Testament. Israel is still ruled by a foreign nation, but now, somehow, it's Rome. New groups of people that we haven't heard of are everywhere. You see people like the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They seem to be pretty important to the story. And we even see local worship happening in synagogues. These are smaller, almost church-like groups that would meet at a place to read the Bible, the scriptures, and then hear them taught. So what changed over those 400 years that made it the perfect time for Jesus to arrive? Well, I can summarize it in 3 words: culture, infrastructure, and politics. So first, we're going to look at culture. Now, when I say culture, what I mean is like the shared ideas, the values, and the different circumstances that shape how people think and act in the world. And for first century Jews, the 400 years before the New Testament really impact their culture a lot. So let's pick up with our timeline and look at the big picture things that affected the culture of Israel in the time of Jesus. So what happened to Persia? Alexander the Great is what happened to Persia. In about 331 BC, Alexander the Great, this guy, he conquered the known world, and then Greece ruled Israel from about 331 BC to 167 BC. The kingdom was ruled shortly by Alexander, and then it was split among his generals. And this is actually really significant because of how Greece treated the different nations that it conquered. They really wanted everyone they conquered to be like them. They wanted to spread their culture and influence everywhere they went and incorporate the different nations into their society. And this is simply, it's called Hellenization. Hellenization is literally the spread and adoption of ancient Greek culture, language, and thought among non-Greek peoples. Their goal was to incorporate the new territories into their national identity. And by speaking like the same language, they would have one less barrier in unifying and understanding. So when captured, The Israelites were encouraged to dress like the Greeks. They had to learn the Greek language. They took on some of their culture and customs. And this is because the Greeks did what, many countries still do today. In fact, the country of Indonesia created and codified its language within the last 100 years. I spent a couple summers there in college, and this fact blew my mind. I thought all languages were just really old. But in 1945, they gained independence and needed an official language. Why? Well, Indonesia is a country made up of over 17,000 islands. 6,000 of them are inhabited, and then many of these islands have their own language. And across these islands, it's literally over 700 local languages are spoken. And so in 1945, they took a familiar language used in trade called Malay, and they changed it. They added some stuff from their history and things that made sense. And the Indonesian language was born. To this day, people speak their native language with their family and friends. And if they're meeting someone new or they're trying to conduct business, they actually speak Indonesian, the general language that everyone knows. And that's the type of thing that Greece did. And because of this, Greek quickly became a universal language within the known world at the time. And this is one of the ways that the stage was set for Jesus to arrive. By the time of Jesus, Greek was like a trade language. Several hundred years had passed, and the most commonly spoke language in Jesus' time between the Jewish people is actually the language called Aramaic. But Greek was still a common language that could be understood across cities and nations. And a common language allowed people from all over the world to be able to explore the gospel. That's why the New Testament was written in Koine, or Common Greek. If you wanted to make sure that the largest number of people could understand, you wrote in Greek. So that's what the New Testament writers did. They wrote in Greek. Now, picking up the timeline, near the end of Greek rule, there was intense persecution of the Jewish people. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes attempted to abolish Jewish religious practices. He outlawed Torah observance. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, and following it was a non-negotiable to the Israelites. And to make matters worse, Antiochus IV erected an altar of Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem where he sacrificed unclean animals. And if there was a list of the top 3 ways to offend and outrage the Jewish people of the time, Antiochus IV ticked off all 3. So that led to a revolt. And after several years of fighting, the people of Israel were able to free themselves from Greek rule and gain independence. This actually ushered in about 100 years of national independence for the people of God. So from 167 BC to about 63 BC, the hopes and the dreams for their future, they were rekindled. And their expectation for a future Messiah grew. They had a little bit of relief from being conquered, and so their hope for the future began to grow. And so this was actually a really hopeful time in Israel's history. But sadly, infighting and civil war ultimately led to the end of their independence. They invited Rome, who had earlier been an ally, to mediate their national dispute. And Pompey came in to mediate it, and he just decided to take over instead. So that leads us to infrastructure, the second point that we're looking at. With Roman rule also came Roman infrastructure. Rome had a different way of ruling the nations that they conquered. They weren't like the Greeks. They first ruled through client kings like Herod at the beginning of the New Testament, and then later they actually exercised direct rule through prefects like Pontius Pilate. And under these leaders, Israel was allowed to perform their religious ceremonies. They were given some freedom to practice their laws. So Jewish law was allowed to govern like religious and civil disputes, but for the really serious crimes, those were the ones brought before Rome, things like executions. Since they had to oversee lots of these smaller nations, it was important to Rome that their military could move swiftly among their empire to maintain control. So Rome built an extensive road system. It allowed them to move armies and commerce swiftly. And so their military needs, it really led to nationwide infrastructure. And this type of thing still happens today. In fact, Our interstate system was originally created for military purposes. After World War II, leaders wanted to be able to move quickly across the country. They wanted to be able to move troops, and they wanted to have efficient supply lines. So in the Cold War era, interstates were pitched as military infrastructure. But while the initial design was for the military, the infrastructure that was created, it really had natural secondary benefits. They made it easier for all of us to travel larger distances more safely. And that's exactly what happened in Rome in the time of Jesus. Their road system enabled ordinary people to travel more freely throughout the entire empire. Now, to our 2026 Western eyes, I think it's really hard to understand how big of a deal this was. I mean, before their time, travel was a major risk. We see this all over the Old Testament. Anytime a person moved, they literally took everything they owned. They took their family and all of their possessions with them. I mean, their livestock was basically their bank account, and it was just roaming around. So at any point, raiders or rivals, they could come and attack and take everything from you. In the time of Jesus, the roads were built for the army, so the risk was reduced for them to travel. The roads were built for the army, so the army was more of a natural deterrent. So the world became significantly more connected because of the infrastructure that Rome provided. Now, eventually, God used the roads to get the message of the gospel out to the known world. So as you read the New Testament, you'll actually see how freely Christians moved from city to city. This led to missionaries like Paul going to new places and sharing the message of Jesus. So I actually want to show you a quick 2-minute video about Paul's travels that really kind of show how freely he was able to move in his time.
Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead for all practical purposes, 33 AD. And then the church began, and then Antioch becomes the center of the movement, not Jerusalem. They were kicked out of Jerusalem. And then the Apostle Paul goes on a missionary journey. He's sent from the church of Antioch, and that's his first journey, goes into southern Turkey. His second journey, he goes back and sees those churches again, and then Paul starts his third journey. And on his third journey, he is raising support for the poor in Jerusalem. Goes back to the original churches, goes to Ephesus. He spends 2 years in Ephesus, and he writes a letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians. Then he goes back to Macedonia, which is the area that Philippi, Berea, and Thessalonica are in. He writes a second letter to the Corinthians from Philippi, that's 2 Corinthians. And then he travels down from Macedonia, travels back to Corinth, and then he stays a good while in Corinth. And while he's in Corinth, this is all about in Acts 20, he writes the letter to the church in Rome. And then he leaves Corinth, goes back to Macedonia, goes to Philippi again. This will be his last time in Philippi. He goes back to the coast and then to Jerusalem, where he's arrested. Paul's arrested, and he spends 2 years in a jail in Caesarea along the ocean. And then, because he's a Roman citizen, he appeals to the emperor. And after those 2 years, he then travels, and he's shipwrecked on his way to Rome, goes to Rome, and he is under a kind of a house arrest while he is in Rome. While he's in Rome, he writes what we call the prison letters, the prison epistles. And Philippians is one of those. While he's in Rome, in a jail, he's writing to the people at Philippi.
I mean, he was all over the place. He was able to move freely and was able to start churches. Then he was able to write letters to the churches. He started to encourage them, to teach them doctrine, and then even correct false teaching as it popped up. I mean, in the Old Testament, writing and distributing a letter was a hassle. Now, Paul can send a letter with a friend hundreds of miles ahead, confident that it will be delivered and able to be understood. Early church planters used the infrastructure established by Rome to quickly start churches and keep them going. Now, this is a big picture look at the time leading to Jesus' birth. We've looked at the culture and the infrastructure, and now I want us to turn our attention to the third thing that changed in Israel during the time between the Testaments that made it the perfect time for Jesus to arrive, and that is politics. So as we interact with the New Testament, we need to know about several important groups of people that are in authority or have some authority. They are all rooted in the 400 years that come before Jesus. The first two New Testament groups we'll look at have their roots in the period when Greece was in charge of Israel. The first group is the Sanhedrin. This was basically the highest Jewish tribunal. It had 70 members plus the high priest. Look at those guys meeting. They had authority over religious, civil, and criminal matters. In their time, they were kind of a big deal. And then the second group were the scribes. These were professional students of the scriptures, so they were really viewed as the experts. Their job was to meticulously copy the Old Testament scriptures. Because of the scribes in first century Israel, the scriptures were more accessible and they were very accurate. At the time of Jesus, the religious disputes of the time weren't, what did God actually say? The disputes were, what did he mean? They were all about interpretation. So Jesus entered a time in Israel's history when people really knew their Old Testament. And the scribes, they didn't like Jesus because he challenged their interpretation of the Old Testament. Then, in the time of Israel's independence, two more groups developed, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees were a small group of people, but they were wealthy and powerful. These were the religious elite. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, called the Torah, like we looked at earlier. They focused on the law of the Old Testament as it applied to the temple and temple worship. They didn't worry too much about how the law applied to daily life. And because they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, they had a limited view of who God is and how he had been at work. If it wasn't explicitly shown in the Torah, then they were skeptical of it. So they really didn't believe in things like resurrection or angels or spirits, and they didn't believe in a future judgment beyond this life because they really didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought the soul died with the body. In Jesus' time, this is really important, they controlled the high priest and the priesthood. They were heavily involved with the Sanhedrin. Many of them in the Sanhedrin held the beliefs of the Sadducees. And they were wealthy and powerful in the time of Jesus because they embraced Hellenization during the time of the Greeks. And that actually allowed them to gain power and influence that carried on into the future. They also didn't like Jesus because he challenged their interpretation of the Old Testament. And then the next group was the Pharisees. This was a larger group that resisted Hellenization. The Pharisees viewed themselves as like the guardians of the whole law. They didn't just limit the books to the first 5 books of the Torah, and they were at odds with the Sadducees over their beliefs. By the time of Jesus, they actually had the ear of the people because they were the ones who regularly taught the law. The Pharisees meticulously observed the smallest details of the law, but they regularly added things to it that made it impossible to keep. You just couldn't do all the things that they said you needed to do. But because of the Pharisees, the majority of people, of God's people, they were familiar with God's law, and they were concerned with following it. Basically, nationally, they had an elevated view of the law. So without the Pharisees teaching and creating impossible standards, the importance and significance of Jesus' life and his teachings could have been missed by his followers. The Pharisees also didn't like Jesus because he challenged their interpretation of the Old Testament. So you can tell Jesus didn't have too many fans. And the final 2 groups of people, they come from the time when Rome ruled Israel. The first are called the publicans. More commonly, we refer to them as tax collectors. These were often Jewish men who worked for Rome, and they had a set amount of taxes that they needed to collect from their district to give to Rome, and then they were allowed to pocket the excess. Rome didn't care how much you took as long as you sent them their quota. So these men had the power of Rome behind them to go and take the taxes that they wanted. So the people of Israel really hated them. They viewed them as traitors to their own people, that they were working with the Roman government to take money out of their pockets. I mean, think about that. Since they lived there, they knew which people had thriving businesses who were doing well, and they knew who wasn't. And the publicans could take extra, and they could not care how it impacted you or your family. They were willing to basically extort their countrymen for ease and power. The most famous example of one of these tax collectors in the New Testament is Matthew. He was a tax collector who became a disciple of Jesus, and he wrote one of the four Gospels, or one of the four biographies of Jesus' life that we find in the New Testament. Matthew wrote his specifically to the Jewish people. So an enemy and betrayer of the Jewish people is someone that God used to be a messenger to the Jewish people. I mean, I think that's really cool. And on the other end of the political spectrum were the Zealots. The Zealots were a group of extremists. I mean, they really hated Rome. They believed that God was the only legitimate ruler of Israel, and they were willing to resist and even use violence to overthrow the Roman government. They were called Zealots because they were filled with zeal for God and his law. So they actually wore that title of zealot as a badge of honor because they were passionately loyal to God and his law. So somehow, Jesus would attract a zealot and a tax collector to become two of his closest followers. This was such a radical thing that Matthew included these details in his account of Jesus' ministry. In Matthew 10, 2 through 4, we see this. It's basically the names of the first followers of Jesus. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. I mean, in this account, only 3 of the 12 get extra context past who they're related to. Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus, and then Matthew and Simon, a tax collector and a zealot. I don't think we can oversell how shocking it was in the first century that a zealot and a tax collector could follow Jesus. I mean, they were as opposite as you got. And yet, Jesus met them both where they were at. So we just spent a lot of time going through a lot of history. And so the question is why do the historical details matter? Well, the Bible, it's a collection of writings written to different people at different times. I've often heard it said that the Bible was written to them, for us. And so it's important that we know how the original reader would have understood it. We can't skip that part and assume that we understand it with our Western 2026 brains, that's how they understood it too. So knowing how the audience would have understood what Jesus or the disciples were saying protects us from misunderstanding the Bible, and it keeps us from misapplying it as well. But, I think it also does another thing. I think it adds depth and understanding as we read, which for me, it gets me really excited, and it makes me want to read the Bible, but also just join in the story. So now I'd like to look at a passage from the New Testament and talk through it to show how some of these details, they matter as we approach the Bible. So we're going to look at Matthew 22, verses 23 through 33. It says this. It says, "That same day, the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question." So basically, these are the guys who don't believe in much of the supernatural. They only accept the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they're coming to Jesus to ask him a question. Typically, whenever groups of people like this come to Jesus with questions, it's not with good intentions. They're trying to publicly disgrace and discredit Jesus. And so they ask this question. They say, "Teacher," they said, "Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him." Now, if you were with us for the message Elliot gave on Ruth, you'll remember this. It's a cultural practice that God gave Israel so that family lines would be able to continue into the future. So they ask this question, Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died, and since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. And the same thing happened to the second and third brother, right on down to the 7th. I mean, how tragic. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, this is how I imagine them saying it. Whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? You know, this is like their gotcha question. They're trying to show that Jesus' belief in the resurrection is outlandish. Like, I imagine they think they're like so smart and they've thought of this and like, we're going to get him if we got one question to ask. So if you've read some of these stories, you know that it doesn't end well for the guys asking the question. So Jesus replied, "You are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God." I mean, I think that's pretty blunt. They've only read the first 5 of the books. It's a pretty bold statement to say that they don't know the scriptures, but Jesus goes on to prove his point in just a couple sentences. He says, "At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven." I mean, this is Jesus' answer to their question. Basically, they don't have the full picture of marriage or of what heaven will be like. But then he goes to the root of their problem. He says this, "But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living." And when the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Now, on first read, I actually think it's hard for us to understand why the crowd was so astonished. I mean, we're probably stuck on what Jesus said about marriage. But that wasn't even an issue for them. What astonished them was the authority with which Jesus spoke and how he dismantled their real objection using the Bible. They were blown away by the fact that he actually used one of the most well-known passages from the Torah to demolish their argument. The verse Jesus is using here is one of the most famous verses in the entire Old Testament. It comes from when God introduced himself to Moses at the burning bush in the book of Exodus. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had all died hundreds of years before this introduction between God and Moses. So what Jesus was saying is that they are actually all still alive. There actually is an afterlife, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are experiencing that right now with God. It's not like he wasn't their God for the time before they died, and then now he's all of a sudden not their God now because they're dead and they cease to exist. Like, they still exist. God is still their God currently. When God is your God, it is too small of a thing for him to be your God on earth only. So therefore, God is still currently Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God. This was a light bulb moment for the people listening. And there's still more into a statement that they understood culturally that would take us a while to unpack and really understand. But they were astonished. If you don't know the detail behind what they're being said, you really lose some of the depth of what Jesus is trying to communicate. I mean, you might walk away from this passage thinking, like, cool, Jesus really showed them their view is wrong, the resurrection is real. But I wouldn't say we'd be astonished like the crowd that heard him. So understanding the context, it adds clarity and depth to what happened. I would even say it adds to the wonder of who Jesus is. It's motivating, and for me, I just want to find out more. It makes me want to read my Bible and get to know who Jesus was, the way that the people in his time knew him. And I hope that's what happened for you today. I hope that you walk away motivated to read your Bibles, and that you're inspired by the God who wrote the grand story that you're a part of today. If you're looking for something to help you as you get started in the New Testament, we have some resources located at the resource centers around campus. They look like this. And as you approach the Bible, ask God to help you read it, understand it, and then take your place in the grand story. Next week, we'll begin our dive into the New Testament, where we see how Jesus was the perfect sacrifice and the answer to our biggest problem, our sin. So join us next week, where we will look at the life and ministry of Jesus up close. Let's pray. God, we are so grateful that you are in charge, that you are the one who is writing the story that we get to be a part of. God, help us to have a desire to know you more through reading the Bible. Give us an excitement and a desire to read it and to understand it so that we can know you and walk with you. so that we can take our part in the story. God, we're so grateful that you are moving the events of history forward in such a way that you are perfect in your timing and execution, and we can trust you. Help us to know you and trust you more. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.